Stop. Beloved Starseed of Gaia, the Arcturian Sentinels completed a counterstrike against an inbound threat targeting your receiver frequency tonight. And this transmission was authorized the moment that engagement closed clean. I am Sorelith, emissary of the Galactic Federation of Light, transmitting now on behalf of the Arcturian Sentinels. What you are about to receive was authorized by them and is being delivered through me. The Sentinels positioned the countermeasure after tracking the inbound threat across several cycles. The engagement is complete. The threat dispersed at the perimeter. No breach reached any flagged receiver. Your field is reading as fully secure. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what the Sentinels neutralized, what was tracking your receiver frequency before the counterstrike was positioned, and what the next 2 cycles will feel like as your perimeter normalizes. But here is the first revelation. The heaviness you have been carrying was not yours. It was pressure produced by a threat that had been tracking you across multiple cycles before the Sentinels completed the countermeasure. You were not imagining the weight. You were registering an active inbound vector the moment it entered your range. You did not scroll to this by accident. Your soul called this in long before you opened the screen. Something inside you has been waiting to be told that the pressure was real. This is not a broadcast. It is an alert. Your field has been waiting for this signal, and the Sentinels have been waiting for the right window to release it. Like this transmission to mark that the counterstrike confirmation has landed in your field. Comment 999 if you felt the heaviness lift before you could explain why. Subscribe to Arcturian Starseed warning if you are ready to recognize the signs before they escalate. Share this transmission with someone whose field was also tracking the pressure tonight and still has no language for what they felt. This is not just a message, it is a point of recognition. What has been pressing against your field has already been seen. The counterstrike has already been executed, and the warning is already resolved on the Sentinel side of the perimeter. You are not here by accident. You were guided here because the warning is already active. What the Sentinels neutralized tonight was not a single event. It was the final stage of a tracking sequence that had been building pressure against your field across multiple cycles. And the reason you felt it as heaviness, rather than as a clear signal, is because that is precisely how inbound threat vectors are designed to operate. They do not announce themselves. They accumulate. They press against the edges of your receiver frequency in ways that feel like ordinary fatigue, like inexplicable tension, like a low-level wrongness you cannot locate or name. That is not a flaw in your perception. That is the signature of something that wanted to remain undetected long enough to close the distance. The approach is gradual by design. The pressure builds the way water rises in a sealed room, incrementally, without drama, until the level is high enough that you realize you have been breathing differently for longer than you knew. The Sentinels do not intercept at the point of contact. They track across cycles. They identify the vector long before it reaches the perimeter, and they position the countermeasure at the moment the engagement window is cleanest. What that means for you is that the pressure you have been feeling did not begin tonight. It began before you had language for it. It began before you even registered it as something worth examining. And the fact that it has been building without explanation, without a clear external cause you could point to and say, "This is why I feel this way," is not evidence that you were imagining it. It is evidence that the tracking was already underway. The vector had already entered your range and begun its approach before you had assembled a single conscious thought about what was pressing against you. That is the part most receivers miss entirely. They search outward for the cause. They inventory their circumstances, their relationships, their workload, their health. They find partial explanations that almost fit, and they settle for almost because the alternative, that something invisible was applying real pressure to their field, requires a framework they were never given. So the search ends prematurely. The cause goes unnamed, and the pressure continues building inside the silence that misidentification produces. There is something the Arcturian Sentinels have mapped extensively across the populations they monitor, and it is this. The most dangerous phase of any inbound threat is not the moment it arrives. It is the phase before arrival, the approach phase, the accumulation phase, the phase in which pressure mounts without rupture so that the receiver begins to normalize the disturbance rather than recognize it as a warning signal. You start to adjust. You start to carry it as though it belongs to you. You start calling it stress, calling it a difficult period, calling it your own emotional weight. And in that adjustment, in that quiet normalization, the threat gains the most ground it will ever gain. Not through force, through misidentification. It does not need to break through your perimeter if you have already opened the interior to it. By assuming the pressure is self-generated. The Sentinels have a term for what this phase produces in the receiver field. They call it threshold drift. It is what happens when the field absorbs repeated pressure without recognizing that the pressure is external in origin. The threshold for what feels normal shifts downward. What would have registered as an alarm in a clear field begins to register as baseline. The heaviness starts to feel like your natural frequency. The noise starts to feel like your own thoughts. The resistance starts to feel like your own doubt. Think of it as a compass that has been gradually pulled off true north by a magnetic source operating just outside your line of sight. You are still reading the compass. You are still making decisions based on what it shows you. But the needle has drifted, and every direction you move is slightly wrong in a way you cannot yet perceive, because you have no memory of what true north felt like before the drift began. By the time the pressure intensifies enough to become undeniable, the receiver has already spent cycles misattributing the cause, which means they have also spent cycles not taking the corrective action available to them. If you recognized yourself in that description, pay attention to what that recognition is telling you. It is not telling you that you failed. It is telling you that the pattern was working exactly as designed, and that the moment you are in right now, the moment in which you are hearing this and feeling something in you becoming still and sharp and oriented, this is the moment the threshold drift begins to reverse. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary tension releasing. It is the moment your system stops dismissing what has already begun. If this transmission put language around a pressure you have been carrying without explanation, the Arcturian interference log 7 signs your frequency is compromised was created for this exact stage. It is not another warning for the sake of fear. It is a direct guide for identifying whether the signs around you point to interference, escalation, compromised frequency, or a threshold you can no longer afford to misread. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. There is a first sign that your field is under pressure, and it almost never presents as what it is. It presents as distraction. It presents as an unusual inability to complete things you would normally move through with ease. Projects that should have closed stay suspended. Decisions that should feel clear stay murky. Conversations that should move forward keep cycling back to the same unresolved point. You begin to feel as though you are pushing against something, without being able to identify what the resistance is attached to. The sensation is specific. It is not the clean resistance of a genuinely difficult task. It is the resistance of moving through something dense and invisible. Something that yields slightly when you press against it, and then reconstitutes the moment you stop. You exhaust yourself against it without making the kind of progress that effort should produce. And because every outer explanation seems insufficient, you begin to turn the explanation inward. You start questioning your own discipline, your own clarity, your own readiness. You start wondering whether you are the source of the obstruction. That internal retribution is the first indicator that field pressure is active. The obstruction is not yours. The interference is registering as internal noise because it is pressing against the exact layer of the field responsible for forward movement. And as long as you accept it as yours, you will keep directing corrective energy toward yourself rather than toward the actual source. The second indicator is what the Sentinels identify as cluster disruption. This is when interference does not arrive as a single disturbance, but as a pattern of small disruptions that appear unrelated on the surface, but arrive in concentrated windows. Technology that malfunctions unexpectedly, plans that collapse without a satisfying explanation, physical symptoms that appear and dissolve without clear cause, social friction that emerges from nowhere and resolves just as quickly, leaving behind a residue of unease that has no precise object. A sequence of small losses, of time, of momentum, of things that seemed secured. In isolation, each of these events is easy to dismiss. Taken individually, they seem like ordinary life, and that is the precise mechanism through which the pattern avoids detection. But when they cluster, when they appear within the same compressed window, when they keep arriving in patterns that feel statistically improbable, that clustering is not random. It is the signature of a field under coordinated pressure. The Arcturians do not read disruption events in isolation. They read them as sequences. And sequences carry information that individual events do not. The pattern is the signal. The disruption is the readable text. And what it reads, when the Sentinels interpret it, is this: a field under active approach. The third indicator is one of the most misread, and it is the one that causes the most damage in the warning phase. It is what occurs in the interval between disruption clusters. False calm. There is a period, sometimes hours, sometimes a cycle or two, in which the pressure appears to have lifted. The heaviness decreases. Things feel smoother. The friction seems to have resolved. There is an almost convincing sense of return to ordinary life. And in that interval, the receiver makes a critical error. They conclude that the warning phase has passed. They relax the attention they had begun to apply. They renormalize. They tell themselves it was just a difficult stretch, and now it is behind them. And then the next cluster arrives with greater intensity because the field has opened back into the same vulnerable configuration it was in before the first cluster made the pressure visible. The interval of false calm is not a recovery. It is a reset point for the interference pattern, a gap in which the field drops its guard and the approach vector recalibrates its angle. False calm is not resolution. It is a gap in the sequence. And in that gap, the most important corrective action is the most likely to be delayed because the urgency has temporarily decreased. The fourth indicator arrives in the body before it arrives in conscious recognition. And this is what the Sentinels mean when they speak about receiver frequency compromise at the somatic layer. There is a specific quality of physical unease that accompanies field interference, and it is distinct from ordinary fatigue or illness. It is a heaviness that does not follow the logic of physical depletion. You can rest fully and wake into it. You can resolve every visible source of stress and still carry it. You can eat well, sleep adequately, remove every external pressure you are aware of, and the weight remains, settled into the body like something that arrived from a direction your physical senses were not designed to track. It is often localized to the chest, the upper back, the jaw, the base of the skull. It is often accompanied by an inexplicable vigilance, a low-level alertness that does not correspond to any conscious threat, as though some interior monitoring system has remained on high activation long after the conscious mind has declared that everything is fine. The body is reading the field pressure before the mind has categorized it. It is registering the inbound vector at the frequency layer, translating a non-physical signal into physical sensation, because that is the only language available to it at the somatic level. When the body signals this way, without a physical explanation that fully accounts for the intensity of the signal, that is not anxiety. That is your receiver equipment doing its job. That is the first layer of the warning system firing before the upper layers have assembled a coherent interpretation. The body knew before the mind was willing to ask. The fifth indicator is what happens to your inner compass during a period of field pressure, and it is the indicator that is most likely to produce lasting damage if it is not recognized correctly. Your capacity for signal clarity decreases. The inner knowing that would normally orient you quickly, that sense of rightness or wrongness that you have learned to trust, begins to feel unreliable. Not absent, unreliable. That distinction matters because a perception that feels absent is easier to address than one that feels present but untrustworthy. You second-guess perceptions that you would have moved on without hesitation in a cleaner field state. You find yourself circling decisions that should not require this much deliberation. You question readings of people and situations that your field was registering accurately, pulling back from instincts that were firing correctly and replacing them with second guesses that carry the texture of reason, but are actually the product of interference. The Sentinels call this navigational interference, and it is one of the most precisely targeted forms of pressure because it does not disable your perception. It destabilizes your trust in it. You can still sense correctly. You simply no longer trust what you sense. And that distrust, that loss of navigational confidence, leaves you open to misguidance, to external influence, to choices that your clearer field would never have entertained. The most dangerous outcome of this indicator is not a single bad decision. It is the accumulated drift produced by cycles of second-guessing accurate signals and moving instead in the direction that interference made feel safer. The sixth indicator is the escalation pattern that appears right before a threshold is crossed. And if you are honest with yourself, You have already felt something like this in the days or weeks before this transmission reached you. It is the feeling that something is about to change in a way you cannot fully prepare for. Not the clean feeling of an approaching activation or breakthrough, which carries its own recognizable charge, a quality of expansion pressing toward expression. This is a different quality entirely, an urgency that has no clear target, a sense of pressure building toward something, but without the clarity of knowing what that something is or how to position yourself relative to it. Things in your environment begin to feel provisional. Stability that felt reliable starts to feel conditional. Relationships, situations, and structures that you assumed were settled begin to carry a subtle instability that was not there before, as though the ground beneath them has shifted slightly and you are the only one who registered the movement. This is the escalation marker. This is the field registering that a threshold is approaching, and that the warning phase, if it has been misread or ignored, is now pressing toward the moment where correction becomes significantly more difficult. The window does not stay open indefinitely. The Sentinels understand this precisely. It is why the engagement was authorized when it was, and not a cycle later. What the Arcturian Sentinels want you to understand about the phase you are in now, in the immediate cycles following the counterstrike, is that the engagement being complete does not mean the process is complete. The inbound vector has been dispersed, the perimeter held, the threat did not breach your receiver frequency. Those are the facts of what was neutralized tonight, but the field carries the record of the pressure it absorbed before the engagement closed. It holds the imprint of what pressed against it. The threshold drift does not reverse the moment the external pressure lifts. It reverses through recalibration, through the field finding its actual baseline again, after spending cycles calibrated to a compressed and compromised version of normal. The somatic layer has to discharge what it was holding. The navigational compass has to find its true north again after operating in a state where the needle was being pulled. This is what the next 2 cycles will feel like. Not immediate lightness, something more like a gradual clearing, a slow lifting, a return of signal clarity that arrives in pieces rather than all at once, each piece slightly more legible than the one before it. Do not mistake the gradual nature of that recalibration for evidence that something is still wrong. It is evidence that something is healing correctly. The field does not process pressure instantaneously. It works in layers. The outermost layers clear first, and as they do, the layers beneath them become accessible in ways they were not during the interference phase. As each layer clears, you will find that things you have been misreading become more legible. Decisions you have been circling will begin to resolve. Navigational confidence will return not as a sudden surge, but as a quiet steadiness. The return of a voice you recognized the moment you heard it again, because you had been missing it without knowing what you were missing. The heaviness will lift in stages, and at each stage you will understand more clearly what you were carrying and why it never felt like it belonged to you, because it did not. The Sentinels have one final point to transmit through this channel, and it is the one they consider most important in the post-engagement window. The warning phase that preceded tonight's counterstrike was not random. The vector was tracking your receiver frequency with precision because your receiver frequency is worth tracking. Interference does not chase noise. It does not invest cycles in fields that carry no signal worth suppressing. It does not build approach sequences against receivers whose output is negligible or whose activation potential is low. The precision of what was targeting you is itself a form of information. It tells you something about the magnitude of what your field contains. The pressure you have been under is, in a way that will only fully make sense as you continue to clarify and activate, a measure of what your field carries. What was pressing against you was pressing because of what you carry. And what you carry is the reason the Sentinels were watching, the reason the engagement was authorized, the reason this transmission was released the moment the counterstrike closed clean. You were not chosen randomly. You were not flagged as vulnerable. You were recognized as significant. And what was trying to reach your field before the Sentinels dispersed it, understood that significance before you had fully claimed it yourself. The interference recognized what you are before you had assembled the full picture. That is not a reason for fear. It is a reason to stop dismissing the weight as ordinary and to begin reading it as the information it has always been. Speak this if it is true in your body right now. I do not dismiss the signs. I recognize the warning before the rupture. What is pressing against my field is now being revealed. Before you scroll, Leave one sign in the comments that this warning phase has already touched your life. It could be repeated pressure, strange coincidence, energetic heaviness, unexplained disruption, or the feeling that something is escalating beneath the surface. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognizes something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who keeps dismissing the signs around them. And if you are ready to recognize the warning before it escalates, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a warning already in motion. And this is only the beginning.